So I'd say welcome to part 2 of what I called Israel, Zionism, and the Middle East. And very, very briefly, last class, just to remind us of what we did, we looked at the emergence of the Jewish national movement, which eventually, as we said, would brand itself under the title Zionism. We looked at the understanding, or at least we tried to understand what this Jewish predicament was all about, or actually, I would say the predicaments in the plural at the end of the 19th century. We looked at this through demography, if you remember. We looked at this through the different or the various options that Jews kind of could go to ameliorate that predicament that they saw that they were in. We looked also specifically at the centrality that the land of Israel, that the Holy Land took with the beginning, very beginning of the Zionist movement, and how the vast majority of Zionists really vouched specifically for the land of Israel. And we'll come back to that this year, how that's a very important turning point at the early stages of the Zionist movement. We also mentioned, just in passing, Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, as we might call it. But specifically, we talked about the Congress, that first Congress, and its importance. And then we also spent some time classifying the strands of Zionism, right? We talked about the different types of Zionism. We talked about political Zionism, cultural Zionism, labor Zionism, political Zionism. Then we also talked about Chaim Weizmann and his talk about later on would be called synthetic, but the idea of bringing all of these together and trying to create something that actually can live together in some type of harmony. And that's where we kind of ended. And I promised that we would start today by looking really at the formative years, the early years of this young movement. Now we can call it Zionism, even though at the very, very beginning, that name was not being used. So I want to today start with looking directly, closely at these early years of Zionism, of settlement, we can call it. So let's go back a little bit, and we'll just ask this question. And that is, where was this land, right? Where is the land of Israel? So as you can see, back then we're talking about the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire is kind of falling apart, but still a very, still a strong entity. And the truth is, we'll come back to this in just a few minutes, we today have the vantage point of saying, oh, we know what happened to the world. But back then, at the beginning, or sorry, at the end of the 19th century, one could argue that they did not really see that First World War coming, meaning the dissolvement of the Turkish Empire was something that people were thinking about, but at the same time, more and more of the other empires were trying to keep that Ottoman Empire intact. And that's going to be important for us a little bit later. So this Zionist movement, right? It envisioned itself in where? In the land of Israel. Well, what were the borders of this land? So to be honest, I would say that besides the fact that we're talking about kind of the Eastern Mediterranean, we're talking about an area that was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. I think the best way to put it is that we're talking about an area that really lacked specific and clear geographical boundaries, right? The place that we're talking about, it kind of stretched from the coastal line in the west to the Jordan River in the east, from a very unclear desert line, border lines that had changed and shifts over time. So we have a general idea what we're talking about, but not something very fixed. And also even the north was also not very, very rigid, not specific, and it's changed over time. But people knew to call this kind of area the land of Israel, but it really lacked specific geographical boundaries. And it is also worth noting that it was located at the periphery of the empire, right? It was kind of the edge of this empire, almost a godforsaken area. And the last thing I'll note about this is that it really had no modern, or to be honest, it had barely any modern infrastructure at this point. And let's go back now again to demography. And you remember that word demography that we looked at the other day, right? The study of population. Now, based on a number of sources, I did kind of the work for you over here. In the late 19th century, there were an estimated 300,000 inhabitants that populated this area, right? The area that we'll soon call Palestina, Eretz Israel. And out of those 300,000 inhabitants, most, and I'm talking 94 to 95%, are Arabs from various tribes and origins. The majority are Muslim, but not only, which means that leaves us with about 20,000 Jews that resided in this sliver of land, but they're not Zionists. The Zionists are going to meet them. It's going to be a very interesting encounter. So we said these were traditional people. These were people that either lived there for a long time or immigrated there out of messianic fervor, out of a religious affinity with the traditional land of Israel. And they lived in these 4 cities, Hebron, Tzfat, Jerusalem, and Tiberias. And they called them holy cities. Why? Because that's where they lived. And that constituted holiness for them. That's where the Jews lived. Now, these were all traditional communities, and they all came from either an Ashkenazi ethnic background. But what's crucial and very interesting, and I think is played down very often, is that the majority, and today we think that it was actually a pretty big majority of the Jews living in the land of Israel at this point, at the end of the 19th century, are actually Jews from a Mediterranean origin, meaning what we would call Sephardi Jews. And that's also interesting. The balance would change later on. But at this early point, Sephardic Jews, they also speak the local language. They actually have somewhat of an advantage over their Ashkenazi brothers and sisters. And we'll talk about the separation of those two entities later on this year. So these Jews were not Zionists. They identified themselves as Jews through their religion and through that affiliation. Again, not anti-Zionists, but they were definitely not Zionists. Now, the Zionists will come and they'll call them the old people, Hayeshuv Yashan, which you'll find this also in scholarship as well, right? The old Yeshuv, the old settlement. They were extremely poor. They literally had no source of subsistence. They relied on philanthropic money, right? They always needed to send out people to bring in money. That was their lifestyle. And they lived in incredible poverty. And that was their life. Now, when the first Zionists immigrated, they arrived in Palestine. And those of you that remember from last class, we gave a year. This really starts in 1881. There was a push, there was a pull. We're not going to go back into that, but 1881 is really a good starting point. And it's a good year to also remember because that a lot of movement starts in 1881. And some of that movement is also going to arrive at Eretz Yisrael, the Holy Land of Palestina. And we're going to come back to the name towards the end of our class over here. So imagine that. Two groups that see themselves as Jews, real Jews, not pretend Jews, with completely reversed an opposite sense of identity and of an opposite sense of a life mission. And they meet. And that's going to be a very, very difficult moment when these two groups meet. We're going to go into that this year. I just want to point out that we can already start to imagine what kind of meeting point will this create, really. And we'll have the option to go into this in detail. Let's, for instance, look at the demography once again, right? These first waivers.
Slide.
Here we go. That's the clash between those pioneers and a sketch that I found in a very cool archive of the main rabbis that represented the Yeshuv Yashan at this point. Very, very different, right? Archaic. Now, the years of the earliest wave of immigration, a little over 20 years of immigration, and we'll talk about these years in a minute. We call this the first aliyah. We're going to come to that word right now. But demography is also interesting because in these 22 years, 25,000 are going to arrive, which means that the balance of powers is going to change just from a demographic sense. That means that by the year 1903, maybe we can just say 1900, we have a completely new demographic story, and that is that the Jews living in the land of Israel, half of them are Zionists and half of them are not, or half of them still live the old lifestyle and some of them are converting and some of them are actually digging in, and this is going to actually be seared into the DNA of the state of Israel later on, these two communities. So put that aside. That's one thing. Now, how do we characterize these guys, right?
Wait, hold on. Are you raising your hand, Jack?
Oh, yeah,
I just have a quick question. I didn't want to interrupt and just cut you off.
No, this is great. What?
Like I do. Just jump in. I clearly have no problem with it. Go ahead.
Intimate discussion over here.
All right, amazing. I just wanted to just clarify, when you're referring to the people, the Zionists and then the people who, as you say, just weren't Zionists, are those the people that are like you said, that had the derogatory name associated with them, the old people?
Uh-huh.
Okay, that's
It's
right.
all the same, right? So they'll never refer to themselves as the old Yeshuv. That's
Right, old
what they
Yeshuv,
give
yes.
themselves. They actually never even think of themselves as one homogenous community. They think of themselves as Jews living in the Holy Land. They have no national aspiration. They're religious Jews. They might have some kind of a messianic idea of life, but there's no larger sense of self there. And so they're going to actually have a problem with these other Jews that speak in a messianic language as well, but a very different, not a religious messianic language, more of a secular one. And we're going to come back to that. And so that's a good point. That's the Yeshuv Yashan, the old folk, right? Not old in the sense, but old way of life. Traditional, we can say that. Let's characterize the other group, these pioneers that, if you remember last class, we will definitely classify them as practical Zionists, right? Those that come with an underdeveloped or almost non-developed idea of what they're actually doing, right? They're following a dream that's not developed yet. They were pioneers. They saw themselves as pioneers, right? Soon they're going to say, we are Zionists when that word starts to occur. They're by and large almost all from Russia. They're by and large, at least they see themselves as, or really are, those that suffered from some kind of persecution. But I would say the right way to look at this is that they're part of the Jewish movement, physical movement, to leave Eastern Europe, which starts around there. And instead of joining the major wave that goes to America, they're joining something else, underdeveloped, and they're going to arrive in the land of Israel. And in these 20 years, from 1881, 22 years, to 1903, and you're going to see why these years, they managed to do something interesting, right? First of all, they build 20 or 21, depending on which historian you want to go by, little farm towns. They call them moshavot, colonies. You remember that from last time. Let's actually look at the next map. This is a map that I literally just found in the archive, and I took an illegal picture of it. So you can see I put a little sticker on the bottom so you know that it's illegal. But what this map tells us is something really cool, because you don't even have to be able to read Hebrew, but you have to just see where these lands were. And they were along the Mediterranean coast. They were then through this cross area over here, known today as the Jezreel Valley, and then up along another little area. If you trace a line, the line kind of goes like this, through and down. They looked at that and they saw the letter N, because it kind of traces the letter N, and they gave it a name. This is the N of the Zionist movement. So the oldest map is the map of an N, not the Holy Land. And they bought this land. We'll talk about land purchasing very, very soon. And they created a new reality in which there is Jewish land that doesn't match those other 4 cities, right? It's a new reality over here. And they built these areas over those 20 years. But it would be too simple a story if I just left it there. Because the first thing I should have actually mentioned before is that after 1 year, by 1882, by the winter of 1882, most of these young pioneers, a very small group, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 of them, they really saw themselves as a great failure. They almost all left. A lot of them would leave. Why did they see themselves as a failure? Why did they feel like they were failing? Well, first of all, economically, they had no money. Then they also learned the hard way that physically, they actually were not up to the challenge. It was too hard to be a farmer. It was too hard to live in this area. They had no knowledge also. They had no infrastructure. Nobody was helping them. They had no money, as I said. They had also very harsh weather to deal with. And on top of that, something that would also become kind of the myth of that period, but it was very true, many of them got very sick with either typhoid or malaria, which is something that spread quite rapidly in the first early years. So they had to deal with all of this. And another thing that actually, I don't find this enough, I would say, in history books, but I think that today more and more people are actually writing about this. And we have to remember these were young kids, and we look through their letters, and they're writing home. And 2 things really permeate all of their letters, if you look at all of them. The first is that they are having a very hard time in overcoming how much they miss their families. And the second thing is that they're literally on the verge of starvation. They are hungry as can be. They write poems about this. Some of them will commit suicide. It's not an easy story to tell. So it's interesting to actually look how that story is told and how much of this is going to be edited out of the Zionist books when this story is told. Some of them will just jump to the end, but it's a difficult story. And by the way, they're going to write letters to anybody that will help them. And one letter actually is going to arrive at the exact right address. This guy named Mr. Rothschild, who is a very interesting philanthropist who's already giving money to other causes. But at this point, he kind of becomes the first person that likes this idea. You can almost say he's already a Zionist before knowing that he's a Zionist. And from that first winter, he's going to send money. And eventually he's going to come and visit these people. And he's going to kind of spread his ownership over the entire enterprise. And he'll run it. He'll run this entire settlement enterprise from France, where he lives, with his money. He's going to have French bureaucrats come and take over each one of these farms. And the locals hate it because they say they're in it just as a business, and we're here out of ideology, and we have real idealism. And there's a whole back and forth. And that's also an interesting topic, which we're not going to get into. But it is very, very true to say that if you take out that one card called Mr. Rothschild, the Baron Edmond de Rothschild, if you take him out, who knows what the story would be? He really saves this entire enterprise in its earliest stage. Questions, comments? Here we have a picture of one of the earliest pictures. They have no idea what they're doing. They're living in tents. And here he is, Mr. Rothschild, actually, in the year 1902, comes on another one of his visits, and he visits the great vineyard that become almost synonymous with his project, right? The great vineyards and the wineries that would be built. Now, this great challenge of the early years of settlement and of the entire Zionist story can actually we can tell that story continuously until the real great break. And what is that great shattering moment, which we'll get to soon? It's got to be the First World War, which, as we'll talk about soon, almost ends the entire project when that war breaks out. And we'll talk about why. But for interesting reasons, which we're going to have to get into because all books have this division, this period of early settlement doesn't go directly from 1881 till 1914, as one would expect, but rather it's divided into 2 parts. And it was not only the historians that divided it into 2 parts, but rather those Zionists themselves came to divide this period into 2 separate happenings, 2 separate periods. They called it the first aliyah, the first wave of immigration, and then the second wave. And they already spoke about it themselves this way, meaning something happens in 1903, or something is going to start to happen in 1903 that will actually end with the First World War in 1914, that is different, is dissimilar from what it was happening up until now. And we're going to have to try to figure that out. By the way, the word aliyah, which you may know, is the word not only to immigrate, it's a borrowed word from traditional Hebrew. It means to ascend. in religious circles, people talk about aliyah not only as to move to the state of Israel, but rather also to be called up to the Torah. So people that have had bar mitzvahs had their aliyah. It's all the same word. And it's not a mistake. It's almost a secularization of this very religiously charged word, and maybe taking away from that other religious compound of that word and saying, no, it has a different meaning. It means to move to the state of Israel. And that too, we'll probably have to talk about this year. So this accepted division between these 2 years has a reason. And once again, as you'll see, I want to jump straight to demography for just a minute. By the end of this second wave, the Aliyah, the second wave of immigration, Aliyah 2, the second Aliyah, an additional 35 to maybe 40,000 Jews are going to move in the next 11 years. So now we're really looking at a different story, a story in which the balance between traditional Jews and Zionist Jews is now completely different. And that's also going to be important for us to understand. And the truth is, I can't really stress this enough, but also the Jews, those pioneers that came during the second wave, and those Jews that came in the first wave, they really did belong to the same exact social cohort of young, educated, urban, middle-class Jews, mostly all from Russia, from small towns. So this really stresses the question, what is the difference between these two waves? What distinguishes these two groups? And to make it easy, this is what distinguishes these two groups. The first is that this second group were more driven. They were more driven specifically because that they belonged to a different brand of Jewish Zionist ideology, because it had a lot of socialist elements, right? The social ideology was coming together. This just, classless, secular society, this is what they had in mind, which did not meet the same expectations of those that had come earlier. The second thing is that they kind of were, these groups that came, and they came, there was a specific event that we'll get to that really pushed a whole wave of immigration of Jews that were thinking about coming, but would they come and when would they come? And eventually, and finally 1903 comes and a big wave comes in. They were very critical, like that other guy that we saw on Sunday. Remember, he was critical of that old scenario of the first wave of Zionists. He said, this is not the way, you're not prepared. They were critical of them. They were critical of almost everything that they were doing. We'll talk about their critique in a minute. They were also influenced by this point by the Zionist movement that already started to work in a political manner. Remember, by this point, we already have 7 Zionist congresses that have taken place. So they already have a much stronger sense of belonging to something that's taking shape and not something that is really underdeveloped. And now, finally, that last event, there was this, I'm almost scared to say a minor pogrom, but it wasn't the greatest pogrom Jews had ever seen. It just happened to be a pogrom that took place in 1903, and it was an extremely broadcasted and covered event. And Jews heard about this all over the world, and it really sent shockwaves. I'm hoping that we'll actually have the opportunity to meet with an amazing historian who wrote probably the book on the Kishinev pogrom and the tilt of history. Why this one event? But we're just going to take it as the event that changes European emigration, Jewish emigration out of Europe, and it creates a new wave. Also, more Jews will move to America now, but also more Jews are prepared and ready to get out of Tsarist Russia at this point. So these are the reasons why we like to think about this group as a little bit of a different group. And one of the great arguments that these newcomers had is that they looked at these other oldcomers, right? Those other kind of Zionists, they called them, and they said, look at you guys talk a big game, you talk about agriculture, who's actually working in your fields? It's all local Muslim Arab workers. They had a great term for this. They called it idolatry, but in Hebrew it actually makes sense. Avodah zarah, right? Foreign labor, but it also means idolatry. That was their critique. They also had a very hard time finding jobs because those first waivers, remember, these are old Zionists, but they can't get along. So those old Zionists, the first waivers, they're not giving jobs to the newcomers. They don't want them. They're saying, you're going to come in with your ideology? No, thank you. So there's a whole split from the very, very beginning. So it's a clash between these groups. This is already the second clash that we're talking about today, the clash between the old Yishuv and the new Yishuv, and a clash between the second wave and the first wave. The next thing I was thinking when I was making my notes, I think it's important to pause on this, and you'll agree or not. So I kind of feel compelled to include this part of this piece of information into our very not general overview, and that is that during these 10, 12 years of the second wave of immigration, something interesting is going to be established. And that is the famous, I don't know if it's really famous, but it's what we call the Eretz Israel Office of the Zionist Movement. Why is this interesting? By the way, created by this guy, Arthur Rupin, who no Israelis besides the name know who this person is, but they know he must be important because every single city has a street named Rupin. Who is Rupin? 99.9% of Israelis have absolutely no idea, but he was a German Jew, and he was an expert in demography and in agricultural development, and he opens this office in Jaffa, by the way, which becomes a very important Jewish hub at that point, a Zionist hub, and he's the person to start to collect and organize the money coming in order to be able to create this platform to buy and purchase land. It doesn't mean that those 20 years before Reuben, all this land was not purchased. It was purchased, but it wasn't purchased in an organized manner. Very often, and this is actually one of the reasons he builds and he opens this office, the land had to be bought twice. Somebody wrote a great poem called "The Land Bought Twice," means it was bought officially by the owners of the land, but then when these young Zionists arrived, they found out that the land was sold behind the backs of the actual people that are living there. So those actual people that were living on the land had to be either bribed, paid, and sometimes it just fell through because that they weren't gonna leave. So it's also interesting to see that. So he opens this office, and this office is going to be the organized office of land acquisition. And it's kind of this, almost I could say, a collective national venture that is created over here. And he's also in charge of immigration. He'll write hundreds of letters. There's so much written about him. So when at this year we come to talk about the real estate issue that is the land of Israel, we talk about the Palestinians and the Israel and the claim to the land. You guys already know who Arthur Rupin is. You have a step up a little bit over everyone else. One of the things that we also have to remember is that, at least for me, I feel also compelled to point this out, is that even though there is this perception that everyone that arrived in Eretz Israel, Palestine during these years, they all joined farming communities, that's actually very false. Far from the truth. The majority of them would eventually arrive in urban centers. Many of them go to Jerusalem, even though they're not part of the old Yishuv, and they'll build new parts of Jerusalem. And they'll be Zionists living in Jerusalem, right? They're urban Jews. But the most interesting is coming up, what urban center will the other Jews move to? And even though the perception is all Jews that came as Zionists, they all work the fields, let's remember that is probably not even 20% of everyone that comes in during these years up until the creation of the state of Israel. It's a small, it's a significant story, but it's not demographically the Aryan part of those coming in. These second wave immigrants, they actually add something that also is worth mentioning, and they're part of what we would call the cultural revival of modern Hebrew culture. And above all, they start using Hebrew far more than the first waivers. They create a teachers association, they create a trade union, and the reason that we remember them as such an important group is because they actually would become the group that becomes the leaders of the Zionist movement down the line. Like David Ben-Gurion and all his people, they're all second waivers. And when they come in, it's very important for them to see that they are different from what came earlier. So they create that into the Zionist ethos as a new, important, significant change. And therefore they get to write history, really. They're the victors in so many ways that get to write history, kind of going back from that point on. By the way, I'll also mention at this point, the second waivers are the founders of a sort of Jewish militia, and they don't look like Jews, but I can tell you this is a Jewish militia that they were there in order to guard the fields. And in so many ways, a lot of historians are going to argue that this is really the first organized Jewish self-defense, right? This can almost be directly linked to Jewish Zionist self-defense that is going to arrive just a few years down the line, and in so many ways, the earliest version of the much later IDF that would be established during the War of Independence. Questions, comments? So going back to what you said before, Charlie, right? The kibbutz, right? I want to pause here, even though it makes sense to jump right to 1914, because that's the next event, right? The First World War, and how that almost completely destroys the Zionist movement. I want to start at a very random year, and that is the year 1909. What happens in 1909? Again, Israelis are like, I don't know what happened in 1909, but 1909 is a very symbolic year because two very interesting things are created. The first, the city of Tel Aviv is founded. So it's an urban center, not based on agriculture, but it's not part of those other cities where Jews live. It's a real city that's being established. It's the cultural hub of the Zionist movement going forward. It's not Jaffa. It's something next to Jaffa. It's new. So Tel Aviv is established in 1909. We all know what Tel Aviv is, right? What else was established in 1909? As you pointed out, the very first collective farm, the collective community, Degania, 1909, that would be imitated from that year on, and many of these collective farms built by these second waivers that are, by the way, having a very hard time, as we saw before. Now they found their way, and they train, they learn agriculture. Many of them are actually going to live in these training farms, which is a very interesting idea. Once again, Arthur Rupin is responsible for that, and they're going to create the first kibbutz, which means a collective farm. So I find it amazingly ironic, but beautiful that both of these extremely different places, right? A kibbutz, a collective farm, no property, all of that. Tel Aviv, right? The symbol of modernity, of individualism, both established in the same year, right? Degania representing the rural, collective, socialist nature of Zionism, and Tel Aviv representing the urban, capitalistic face that Zionism would have. And yet, despite the differences, I think that there's something very important, or a few things that are very important that they have in common. Like, what do they have in common? Well, the first is that they are the modern. They're different versions, but they are the modern. They also represent the secular, whatever that means. And they really are the two entities that are going to usher in what we call the new Hebrew society. So hold on to all of that. It's going to come in very handy this year. Just a few years later, as I mentioned, this entire project almost descends into complete disarray, into a standstill. And we need to pick up with that because now we arrive at this great event, the First World War. So that's going to be our bookend. The First World War almost destroying everything that we just talked about. Now, the impact really cannot be overstated, how much impact this is going to have on the Jews in Europe, on the world, on the Middle East, and specifically on what we're calling now the Yeshuv. So we talked about the Yeshuv Yashan, the old wave. We talked about the Yeshuv Chadash, the newcomers, first and second wave. But if you want to just group all of them together, anyone living in the land of Israel, in this non-community that is a community based on its geography, we can just use the generic term, the Yeshuv. It includes old and new, and they're starting to come together, at least geographically, they're coming together. So why do I think that this First World War was such a great, difficult moment for the Jewish Yeshuv? By the way, I don't know how many of us know that the Middle East was not just like an afterthought of the First World War, but the First World War was extremely present in the Middle East. Not only that the Middle East would be reshaped after the war, but the war took place in the Middle East. I mean, this is an amazing picture of soldiers of the Imperial British Army, but these are soldiers from New Zealand. And there's another picture, which I couldn't find, of Indian soldiers outside of Cairo, getting ready for a big battle. The battle over, not Gaza, but next to Gaza, Beersheba, which through that battle, the tilt of the war would start, which would actually bring down the Ottoman Empire in so many ways, and it would begin the end of the war. So the Middle East is very, very important, and we're not going to go very much into that, except for saying that it is part of the arena that the First World War takes place, not a sidekick, not a side note, but an actual part of the First World War. Now, all historians are going to agree, and do agree, that the Middle East will never look the same after this war is over. And just to remind ourselves, what does this war look like? So this is a war of two coalitions that fought each other, England, France, and Russia, later the United States. They're on one side, and they'll fight the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Ottoman Empire. And once again, this is not a course about the First World War, so we're just going to take this and we're going to run with this. So Europe is really divided between fighting enemies. And for the Zionists, this is going to be a very complicated moment. The first moment of complication is that we have to remember the headquarters of the Zionist movement at this point is in Berlin. Interesting. Berlin is the headquarters of where the Zionist movement sees itself for very interesting reasons. So that's in Berlin. The financial center is in England. However, the potential manpower, meaning where is this Zionist movement going to grow through immigration? Where is that coming from? That's in Russia. But the land itself that they all aspire to get to, right, the Zionist movement, Zion, is in the Ottoman Empire. So you already see what a mishmash this is going to be for the Zionist movement, because that it's going to be very, very hard to do a bunch of things. It's going to be hard to communicate. Communication is almost completely going to stop during this war. Vast immigration, that comes to a complete end. Money, you can't transfer money from place to place. Sea transportation is completely shot. And I think even though this seems like something small, in my mind, this is the biggest thing. The annual Zionist Congress is going to be suspended. It doesn't meet. That means that sense of continuity, the way for them to come and talk about what the year saw and where do we send money and what do we do, all of what we've been talking to up until now, that is going to end in 1914. And that's going to be a big, big problem for the Zionist movement. How do you organize yourself through such turmoil? Now, one thing that we're going to come back to, and I think that it's worth mentioning because it's just too interesting to pass on, but we'll talk about it this year, is that there was another crucial element that this war, you could say, really tragically challenged the Zionist movement. And that is what I would call the sense of Jewish nationality. Let me explain. In this picture over here, you see we have Jews, enlisted Jews in the Austro-Hungarian army. That's the picture that you see on your left. On the right, we see Jews in a Jewish battalion, First World War, not Second, in the German army. Now, what's fascinating, and people have actually started recently to write about this because it hasn't been written about enough, that most Jews supported the countries that they were in. German Jewish soldiers are going to fight against French Jewish soldiers, and British soldiers in the British soldiers are going to fight and even kill other Jewish soldiers. So Jews are killing each other in this war. So what this actually means is that the sense of Jewish solidarity was not the underlying commonality, right? What was? The national solidarity was what it was all about. So that means that the sense of Jewish nationalism is actually going to be put to a test over here. And it's not going to be that Jews see themselves as a nation, therefore they don't fight with their countries. They're actually first fighting with their countries. And this is going to be a really, really interesting moment for the Zionist movement as well, to write about this and to think through this predicament over here. Now, for us, what's maybe important is that despite these war obstacles, something interesting does happen that I could say, it is a positive or at least an outcome that we have to address. Because before I said, right, the Zionist movement was all completely destroyed. However, during this war, a few prominent Zionists would kind of come alive, right? They would be recognized for their war effort during this war. The first, which we mentioned the other day, was Chaim Weizmann. Remember this guy, right? So this guy, a Russian-born Jew, immigrated to England, becomes a Zionist. He was a very famous scientist, and he worked as a chemist in the British War Office, and he improved some kind of ammunition and also coded relationships. And so many big wins in the British war effort are thanks to this guy. And he would be remembered later on, and he would really rise to a very prominent, become, if I'm not mistaken, Sir, and a very, very important individual. And the British would remember this later on as, oh, this guy is somebody that we really owe a lot to. Another guy was Joseph Trumpeldor, again, Russian Jew, and he was a very important battalion head in the British Army, right? So here we have Jews that are not just soldiers, but they're serious soldiers in the army. And this is also going to be important later on. And maybe the most famous is this guy, Ze'ev Jabotinsky. He would be a very important political figure, one of the fathers of political Zionism later on. We'll talk about his importance later on this year. And he too not only joins the British Army, not only as an officer, but he's also someone who argues and gets his way in creating Jewish battalions in the British Army. So it's not Jews in a battalion, but rather a Jewish battalion in the army. And this is going to be very, very important later on. So even though basically before I said that the war ended all Zionist activity, it's not. There was one area where it strengthened. And one of the things that it strengthened, and it's important to point out here, is that it strengthened the British Zionist Center. Britain would now become the new hub of Zionist work besides Eretz Yisrael Palestina. These Ottomans, they viewed the Jews that came from Russia to Eretz Yisrael as an enemy during the war, right? So a lot of these Russians that are coming and they're Zionists, suddenly the war breaks out. And the Ottomans, who are their great enemy is the Russian Empire, they're against each other. They see themselves as the enemy, the fifth column. So one of the things that the Ottomans do is that they force compulsory enlistment into the Turkish army. So now you have Zionist Jews living in Tel Aviv, and they have to decide, am I going to join the Turkish army? That doesn't seem like it makes too much sense. But at the same time, I'll be deported. And it's interesting, out of about 80,000 Zionists that are living in the Yishuv at that point, or 80,000 Jews, to be honest, not all of them are Zionists, many of them are going to be deported. Records tell us that about, and these are some of the pictures that I once again took under my shirt pictures when I was in the archives, of the great deportation from Tel Aviv. 11,000 Jews are going to be deported from Tel Aviv. You'll never guess where they were deported to. They were deported to the city of Alexandria in Egypt. And that's where they wait out the war. So that also now becomes a very interesting Zionist hub waiting out the war in Egypt at that point over there. Because the Ottomans, what they feared was collaboration between the Jews and the British, and also between the Russians. And it was a huge, huge mess. And by the way, I'll also mention that there was even a small, yet amazing, story of Jewish espionage, right? This amazing story that would actually become, you could say, mythologized and nationalized, a small underground Jewish espionage network worked out of a northern part of the state of today, the state of Israel, back there, not the state of Israel. And they provided intelligence to the British. They would eventually be found, and some of them were executed. But it becomes a very interesting story. And the Turks were very wary of this. They were nervous that the Zionists, who openly favored the British, that they would become a problem for them during the war. So here we added another element of a predicament to the Zionist movement. So finally we arrive, by the way, this is a great book if you want to read it, A Strange Death by Hillel Halkin, about this espionage group. The war will come to an end. This is a picture actually from 1918, when General Allenby walks through and declares Jerusalem as a British city, which is very, very interesting. The British actually took almost an entire year to conquer the land of Israel. Even though they won a very important battle in 1917, it took almost an entire year until they actually marched into Jerusalem. And really, at that point, the war is almost completely over. Israel, or the land of Israel, now officially going to be called by the British Palestine Eretz Yisrael, is going to officially come under a new way of government. We'll already give it a name. It's going to be called the mandate system. So it's not colonialism, but it's not colonialism. It's the mandate system. I'll say one sentence is that even though the British and the French and other groups love this idea of the mandate system, because we have to move away from colonialism, for the subjects that lived in these lands, they saw no difference between mandates and colonies. It was all the same. It was just a new name. So they experienced it as the same, but the names will change. So we're going to talk about that, pick up from here, from General Allenby, the end of the First World War, the new system, talk about the division of the Middle East, and maybe a little bit about the British mandate period if we have energy at the end of next class.